By the autumn of 1815, the Marquess of Aldenmere had declined, in various forms and with varying degrees of diplomacy, the interest of 23 women. He had not counted them himself. Someone else had counted them. Lady Pemberton, most likely, who kept a comprehensive mental ledger of these things, and who had reported the number to her husband with the expression of a woman encountering a phenomenon she found both baffling and professionally offensive. The rejections had not been unkind. That was the thing that made them, in certain respects, worse. He was not cold about it. He was not dismissive. He listened to every conversation that was placed in front of him with the polite, attentive courtesy of a man who was genuinely present. And then he was simply not interested. Not interested in a way that was perfectly clear and that left no purchase for hope or strategy or the kind of persistence that had succeeded against more reluctant men. The mothers of England had been trying to understand it for 2 seasons. The theories were various. He was still grieving some unnamed loss. He had impossible standards. He had been too long in his own company and had lost the capacity for the kind of feeling that led to matrimony. He was simply too particular, which was the phrase used for men who were difficult when used about men, and had different and less charitable meanings when used about women. Lord Aldenmere himself, if asked, and he was occasionally asked, by people who felt that directness was preferable to speculation, said only that he had not met anyone who made him feel the thing he imagined matrimony should be founded on. This answer was considered both romantic and maddening, and did nothing to reduce the speculation. He was 29 years old. He was tall and dark-haired, and had the kind of face that rewards attention. Not immediately striking, but the face of someone who became more interesting the longer you looked. He had, as of the 2nd week of October, been at his Wiltshire estate for 3 months, following a London season that had produced nothing except the 23rd polite non-engagement and a renewed appreciation for the quiet. He was in the drawing-room when she walked in. He was not expecting anyone. She was not expecting him. The drawing-room, it would later emerge, was not where she had intended to be at all. Nora Sutton had been looking for Aldenmere Farm. This was a reasonable thing to be looking for. Aldenmere Farm was a working tenant farm on the estate she was visiting, her cousin's estate, borrowed for October, which she was using as a base for the survey work she had been conducting for the past 3 weeks across 4 farms in the Wiltshire Valley. She had been conducting surveys of agricultural drainage patterns, which was the kind of work that required walking fields in all weather, and that had, over 3 weeks, been generally ruinous to the condition of her boots. She was a land agent's daughter. She had been helping her father with survey work since she was 14. She was 24 years old, and she knew more about drainage gradients and soil composition and the specific problems of clay-heavy Wiltshire fields than almost anyone in the county. And she was very good at her work, and she had completely misread the map. The map had been drawn by her cousin's steward, who had excellent penmanship and a cavalier approach to scale, and who had indicated Aldenmere Farm with an arrow that Nora had followed with complete confidence for half a mile before the path deposited her at the front door of a house that was considerably larger than any farm had a right to be. She had looked at the house. She had looked at the map. She had looked at the house again. She had thought, I need to find out where I am and get back on the right path before the light goes, because October light in Wiltshire went early, and she had 2 more fields to look at before she lost it. She had knocked. A butler had opened the door. She had said, "I appear to be lost. Could you direct me to Aldenmere Farm?" The butler had said, with the careful expression of a man encountering something his training had not specifically covered, "Perhaps you would like to come in." She had looked at her boots, which were, she acknowledged, comprehensively muddy, the product of 3 hours in wet fields, and said, "I probably shouldn't, given the state of me." The butler had said, "His lordship is in the drawing-room. He may be able to assist you with directions." She had thought, "His lordship?" Which meant this was a significant house, which meant she had gone considerably further wrong than she had realized. She had said, "All right, but I'll stay near the door." She had not stayed near the door, because the butler had led her down a corridor and opened a door and announced her, before she had fully processed that being announced was about to happen. And she had walked into a drawing-room and found, instead of the quick conversation with a land agent or steward she had been expecting, approximately 15 people. 15 people in a drawing-room in the middle of the afternoon, all of whom had turned to look at her. She looked at them. She looked at her boots. She looked back at them. She said, "I am so sorry. I think I may have made several wrong turns." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then she started to laugh. Not a polite, social laugh, a genuine one, the slightly helpless laugh of someone who has assessed the situation and found it objectively, irredeemably funny. She stood in the doorway of a drawing-room full of finely dressed people with mud up to her ankles and a map that had entirely failed her, and she laughed. And the laugh was warm and real and entirely undefended. Several people in the room exchanged glances. One person did not exchange glances with anyone. He was standing near the window. He was always standing near windows, she would discover, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not yet read, but that was, she would later understand, the expression of a man who had just encountered something entirely outside his existing categories. He crossed the room. He said, "I am Aldenmere. This appears to be your destination, in a manner of speaking. Can I help you find where you actually need to be?" She said, "I need Aldenmere Farm. I have a map that I trusted too much." He said, "I can show you. May I see the map?" She produced it. He looked at it. He said, "My steward drew this." She said, "Your steward has a flexible relationship with scale." He looked at her. He said, "Yes, he does. Give me a moment." He went to find his own map. She stood in the drawing-room doorway and looked at the 15 people who were looking at her and said, "I apologize for the boots. It has been a working day." A woman in the front of the group, older, with the assessing eye of a social professional, said, "Are you surveying?" She said, "Drainage patterns. Clay soil in the valley has been backing up, and 3 of the 4 farms I am looking at have flooded twice this autumn." The woman blinked. She said, Do you work in land survey?" She said, "My father is a land agent. I assist him." The room absorbed this. He came back with a better map. He led her to the door. He showed her where she had gone wrong, which was a full half-mile from the correct path, at a fork that was not well marked. She said, "I see it now. Thank you." He said, "It is a 20-minute walk." She said, "I know. I have time." He said, "The light goes early." She said, "I know that too." He looked at the fields she would be walking through, and then at her, and said, with the tone of a man making a practical decision, "I will walk with you." She said, "You really don't have to." He said, "I know." He got his coat. She looked back at the house, at the drawing-room window where several faces were visible, and thought, well. She thought, this is not how the afternoon was supposed to go. She thought, the drainage survey is still going to get done regardless. She walked into the field. He walked beside her. and the afternoon went in a direction that neither of them had planned for. He had offered to walk with her for practical reasons. He told himself this firmly and with conviction for approximately the first 4 minutes of the walk, which was how long it took before the conversation became interesting enough that the practical reasons became irrelevant. She talked about the drainage problem with the focused, specific fluency of someone who genuinely understood it. Not performing expertise, not explaining things for an audience, simply thinking out loud in the way of someone who was used to working through problems by speaking them. She described the clay gradient and the winter rainfall patterns, and the specific failure of the existing drainage channels with the precision of someone who had spent 3 weeks looking at the evidence directly. He had been managing estates since he was 22. He knew the basics of agricultural drainage. He did not know it the way she knew it. He asked questions. She answered them without the modulation that people usually applied when explaining things to lords. The careful simplification, the slightly apologetic quality of someone aware that they know more than the person they are speaking to and are trying to make that comfortable. She answered directly, at full register, with the complete assumption that he could keep up. He found this, to his considerable surprise, enormously refreshing. He had spent 2 seasons being talked to in the particular way that people talked to marquesses. Always a slight performance underneath the substance. Always the awareness of his position shaping the conversation. He had become so accustomed to it that he had stopped noticing, until its absence made the difference visible. She was not performing anything. She was walking through a field in October, looking at drainage gradients and talking about them. They reached the fork in the path she had missed. She stopped and looked at both options. She said, "How is it not marked?" He said, "It has always been marked internally. I have not thought about it from the perspective of someone approaching for the first time." She said, "You should think about it. If the tenants have guests, or if you have surveyors coming in, it will keep causing confusion." He said, "You are giving me estate management advice." She looked at him with the clear, slightly amused gaze he was beginning to identify as her default. She said, "I am giving you wayfinding advice. The distinction matters." He said, "Does it?" She said, "Wayfinding is practical. Estate management is political. I am only qualified in one of them." He said, "Based on the last 20 minutes, I would dispute that." She looked at him. She said, "You should not let people talk down to you about your own land. I notice you know more than you were pretending to earlier." He blinked. He said, "I beg your pardon?" She said, "You asked beginner questions for the first 10 minutes, and then you stopped and started asking different ones. The second set were not beginner questions. You were being polite about the knowledge gap." He looked at her. He said, "I was following your reasoning. The initial questions were genuine." She said, "Fair. I withdraw the observation." He said, "You are not going to withdraw it. You believe it." She said, "I withdraw it as an accusation. I maintain it as an observation." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation. He said, "How long are you in the county?" She said, 2 more weeks. I have 4 farms. I have done 2.5, and I need another week for the remaining valley survey and half a week for the reports." He said, "Who do the reports go to?" She said, "My cousin, who owns 3 of the 4, and the 4th goes to the land agent for the neighbouring estate."
He said, "The neighbouring estate is mine." She stopped walking. She looked at him. She said, "Aldenmere is the neighbouring estate." He said, "Yes." She said, "The fourth farm is one of yours." He said, "It appears so." She looked at the map, then at him, then at the map again. She said, "Your steward should have told me." He said, "My steward did not know you were coming. The arrangement was made through the neighbouring agent." She said, "I have been surveying your drainage problem for 3 weeks, and nobody told me it was your drainage problem." He said, "And I have been reviewing a drainage report about my valley for 6 weeks without results, and apparently the results are in a field somewhere, wearing muddy boots." She stared at him. Then she started to laugh again, the same laugh as the drawing room, warm and genuine, and entirely unguarded. He found, standing in a Wiltshire field in October, that he was laughing too. It was, he thought, the first time he had laughed like that in a considerable while. He thought, "She has mud on her boots, and she has been surveying my land for 3 weeks, and she just told me I was performing ignorance, and she found the whole situation funny." He thought, "I would like to see the survey." He thought, "I would like to see a great deal more than the survey." She showed him the survey on Friday. He had asked on Wednesday, at the end of the walk, when they had reached Aldenmere Farm, and she had satisfied herself with the initial assessment of the eastern field, and he had stood at the gate feeling, for the first time in several months, that an afternoon had been genuinely well spent. She had said, "The report will not be finished until next week." He had said, "I don't want the report. I want to see the work." She had looked at him with the assessing quality that he was coming to know. She had said, "Friday at 9. Bring boots you don't mind ruining." He had brought appropriate boots. They had spent 3 hours in the valley fields, moving from one drainage channel to the next, while she explained what she had found and what it meant, and what she thought should be done about it. She had her notebooks with her, 3 of them, full of measurements and sketches and the precise, detailed observations of someone who had been paying very close attention for 3 weeks. He read the notebooks while she explained the 3rd field. The work was excellent. He was not an expert, but he knew enough to assess it, and the assessment was clear. She had found the problem, a specific blockage in the upper channel that was backing water through the clay and into the lower fields in a pattern that explained every flood report for the past 4 years. She had also found the solution, which was less expensive and more effective than anything his own steward had proposed. He said, "This is the best analysis of this valley anyone has produced." She said, "It is the first thorough analysis of this valley anyone has produced. Your previous surveys were surface only." He said, "I know. I was not happy with them." She said, "You should not have accepted them." He said, "I know that too." She said, "You keep knowing things after the fact." He said, "I am working on knowing them before." She looked at him with the slight smile that appeared when he said something she found worth noting. She said, "That is a reasonable project." He said, "I have a capable consultant, apparently." She said, "I am your neighbour's cousin's borrowed surveyor. That is not a consultant." He said, "It could be." She looked at the field. She said, "I have a father who needs my help, and 4 more counties of survey work contracted through the spring." He said, "I know." She said, "That is not a situation that has room in it." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Then why?" He said, "I am not asking for room.
I'm saying that if the work brings you to Wiltshire again, the 4th farm is mine, and the standing offer of better maps and accurate scale is available." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "That is a very restrained thing to say." He said, "I am capable of restraint when the situation requires it." She said, "The situation requires it." He said, "I know." She looked at the field for a moment. She said, "The upper channel needs to be cleared before the winter rains. If it is not done by November, the flooding this year will be worse than last." He said, "I will have it done." She said, "I can send specifications." He said, "I would appreciate that." She looked at him one more time, the clear, direct look that took stock without performing the taking. She said, "You are not what I expected when I walked into that drawing room." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I did not have time to expect anything. I was laughing too hard." He said, "And now?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I am not sure yet. I will tell you when I am sure." She closed the notebook. She walked back across the field. He watched her go. He thought, "She will tell me when she is sure." He thought, "I can wait." He thought this with more patience than he had felt about anything in a very long time. She sent the specifications on Monday. They were detailed, precise, and written in the same direct style as everything she said. No unnecessary preamble, no social cushioning, simply the information clearly expressed and the reasoning clearly stated. He read them twice and then had his steward read them, and his steward said, with the slightly deflated expression of a professional encountering work better than his own, "These are very thorough." He wrote back. Not about the specifications, those had been passed to the steward for implementation. He wrote because the specifications had come with a single line at the end, after the technical content, that said, "I hope the boots survived." And that line required a response. He wrote back and said, "The boots survived with distinction. The field did not." She wrote back and said, "That is the correct relationship between boots and fields." He wrote back and said, "I have a question about the 3rd drainage channel that my steward cannot answer." She wrote back and answered the question, and then said, "I have a question about the soil composition in the upper valley that your records might illuminate." He had his steward find the records. He sent them. She sent back an analysis that solved a problem she had been working around for 2 weeks. He read it and thought, "She thinks like no one I have met." He wrote back and said, "I did not know the Hartwell soil maps existed." She wrote back and said, "Most people don't know what is in their own records. It is one of the more frustrating things about this work." He wrote back and said, "What is the most frustrating thing?" She wrote back and said, "That the people who know the land best are always the tenants, and nobody asks them." He thought about this for a long time. He had his steward arrange meetings with the tenants. He wrote and told her. She wrote back and said, "Good." He found in the 3rd week of October that the letters had become the thing the day organised itself around. Not as letters usually organised a day, not with the weight of obligation or the management of affairs, but with the particular quality of something looked forward to. He had not looked forward to correspondence in a very long time. He had not, if he was honest, looked forward to much in a very long time. He had been managing things: the estate, the family obligations, the season, the 23 polite non-engagements. with the competent, somewhat hollow efficiency of someone going through the correct motions without the animating energy that makes motions into something more. He was not hollow when he was writing to her. He was thinking, properly, fully thinking, about things that mattered, and about things that did not, and about the specific quality of a laugh in a drawing-room doorway that had been, he was now willing to admit, the most alive he had felt in years. He wrote, at the end of October, a letter that was not about drainage. He said, "I find I am running out of legitimate technical questions, and I am not yet willing to stop writing." She did not write back for 2 days. He thought, "I have misjudged." He thought, "I have made it something it was not." He thought, "She said the situation required restraint, and I failed to maintain it." On the 3rd day, her letter arrived. She said, "I have been trying to determine what to say." She said, "I am not good at this part. The technical part I am good at. This part I am less practiced in." She said, "I find I am also not yet willing to stop writing." She said, "I will be in Wiltshire again in March. My cousin has a 5th farm. It appeared on a different map." He read this letter 4 times. He wrote back immediately. He said, "March is a long time." She wrote back and said, "I know." He wrote back and said, "I will be in Somerset in November. My family has a property there. Somerset is not far from Wiltshire." She wrote back and said, "Somerset is 40 miles from Wiltshire." He wrote back and said, "40 miles is a morning's ride." She wrote back and said, "It is a very committed morning's ride." He wrote back and said, "I am capable of commitment when the situation warrants it." She did not write back for a day. Then she wrote, "My father will be in Somerset in November. He is surveying the Durston estate." He wrote back, "I know the Durston estate. My family has used the same land agent for 30 years." She wrote back, "That land agent is my father." He stared at this letter for a long time. He thought, "Of course it is." He thought, "Naturally." He thought, "The daughter of my family's land agent has been surveying my drainage problem and corresponding with me about soil composition, and has just told me that the situation, which required restraint, is considerably more complicated than muddy boots and a wrong turn." He wrote back, "I will be in Somerset the 2nd week of November." She wrote back, "So will I." He wrote back, "Good." She wrote back, "Yes." He folded the letter. He thought, November. He thought, that is 3 weeks. He thought, with the particular patience of a man who had found, finally, the thing worth waiting for. I can wait 3 weeks. Her father was exactly what he had expected, and nothing like what he had expected, simultaneously. Thomas Sutton was 60, broad, with the weathered quality of a man who had spent 40 years outdoors, and whose opinion of people was formed by a single criterion. Did they understand the land they were responsible for, and if not, were they willing to learn? He had, apparently, been the Aldenmere family's land agent for 30 years, and the current Marquess had been his employer for 7 of those years, and Thomas Sutton had an opinion about the current Marquess that he had formed over 7 years of professional interaction, and that he had never had occasion to revise. He said, on the evening of the 2nd day, when his daughter was out of the room, and he and Lord Aldenmere were alone in the sitting-room of the borrowed house, "You write to my daughter?" It was not a question. Lord Aldenmere said, "I do." Thomas Sutton said, "About drainage?" Lord Aldenmere said, among other things. Thomas Sutton looked at him with the assessing, unhurried quality of a man who has been forming opinions for 60 years and is in no rush. He said, "She is not going to change." Lord Aldenmere said, "I know." He said, "She is going to keep working. She is going to walk fields in bad weather and write survey reports and tell people things they do not want to hear about their soil composition." Lord Aldenmere said, "I know." He said, "She is not going to become a marchioness in the way that people expect marchionesses." Lord Aldenmere said, "I know." "I find I do not want a marchioness in the way that people expect them." Thomas Sutton looked at him. He said, "You have rejected 23 women." Lord Aldenmere said, "How do you know that number?" He said, "I know everything that happens in the estates I manage. It is my job." Lord Aldenmere said, 23. He said, "Yes." Lord Aldenmere said, "I did not count them." Thomas Sutton said, "I know. That is either carelessness or indifference, and I am not certain which." Lord Aldenmere said, "Indifference. I was not present for any of it in the way that mattered." Thomas Sutton was quiet for a moment. He said, "And now?" Lord Aldenmere said, "Now I am present in the way that matters, entirely, for the first time in a long time." Thomas Sutton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The drainage report for Durston is going to take until Thursday." Lord Aldenmere said, "I have time." Thomas Sutton said, "Nora will be in the South Field tomorrow morning. She starts at 8. Lord Aldenmere said, "I will be there at 8. Thomas Sutton nodded once, with the decisive finality of a man who has made an assessment and is satisfied with it. He said, "The second field is the difficult one. She will need help with the measurements." Lord Aldenmere said, "I can hold a measuring rod." Thomas Sutton said, "I know you can. You have been learning." He said this with the tone of a man who had been watching from the professional distance of 30 years and had noted the learning and approved of it. He stood. He said, "Good night, my lord." Lord Aldenmere said, "Good night, Mr. Sutton." He went to bed thinking about the South Field at 8. He was there at 7:50. She was already there. She looked up when she heard him coming and said, "You are early." He said, "I was told the second field was difficult. I wanted to be prepared." She said, "Who told you that?" He said, "A reliable source." She looked at him with the clear, slightly amused gaze he had been corresponding with for 3 weeks, and that was, in person, even more affecting than it had been in his imagination, which had been considerable. She said, "Did my father talk to you last night?" He said, "We had a brief professional conversation." She said, "About me?" He said, "About drainage primarily." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "My father likes you." He said, "I am glad. I respect him enormously." She said, "He does not like most people." He said, "I know. He told me." He framed it differently, but the meaning was clear. She was quiet for a moment. He said, "Nora." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. She noticed. She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been not saying something for 3 weeks, out of the restraint that the situation required, and I find I am done with the restraint." She said, "Say it." He said, "I am in love with you. I have been since a drawing room in October, when you walked in with mud on your boots and laughed at yourself in front of 15 people,
and I understood immediately that you were the only real thing in the room. I have been corresponding with you for 3 weeks about drainage, and I have been thinking about you for 3 weeks about everything else. I am done performing indifference to the situation, because I do not feel indifferent to the situation. She stood in the south field of the Durston estate, with her survey notebook and her measuring rod, and her boots that were already acquiring the early mud of a Somerset morning. She said, "That is a very direct thing to say in a field at 8 o'clock. He said, "I have been learning directness from a reliable source." She said, "I am going to finish this survey." He said, "I know." She said, "And then I am going to go home and write my reports and spend the winter in Surrey with my father." He said, "I know." She said, "And in March, I am going to be in Wiltshire for the 5th farm." He said, "I know." She said, "And I am telling you all of this because I want you to know what you are, what this is, what the actual shape of it is." He said, "I know the shape of it. I have known since she will tell me when she is sure." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "I am sure." She said it the way she said everything, directly, without decoration, the precise truth of it stated clearly and left to stand on its own. He breathed. He said, "Good." She said, "Now hold the measuring rod."
He held the measuring rod. They measured the field, and the Somerset morning went on around them, practical and clear and entirely sufficient. London said, when the engagement was announced in December, that it was very unexpected. This was the polite version. The impolite version, circulating in the drawing rooms that Lady Pemberton frequented, was a land agent's daughter. After 23 refusals, a land agent's daughter who surveys fields. Lady Pemberton herself said to her husband, on the morning the announcement appeared, "I would like to meet her." Her husband said, "Why?" She said, "Because 23 women could not interest him, and she walked in, lost with mud on her boots, and he is engaged within 2 months. I want to know what she is." Her husband said, "A land surveyor, apparently." Lady Pemberton said, "That is what she does. I want to know what she is." She met Nora in January at a dinner arranged by Lord Aldwych, who was, as always, the social architect of significant moments, and sat beside her for 2 hours and talked about drainage and estate management and the specific problems of clay-heavy soil in the west of England, and came away with the expression of a woman whose question had been answered. She said to her husband, "She is exactly what he needed." Her husband said, "A surveyor?" She said, "Someone who is not trying to impress him. Someone who has something to do that matters to her, and who was not at that drawing room to be looked at. He has been looked at for 2 seasons, and he is tired of it." And she walked in looking at a map and not at him, and it undid him completely. Her husband considered this. He said, "That is either very simple or very complicated." Lady Pemberton said, "It is both. That is generally how the real things are." Nora was not oblivious to London's opinion. She had told Lord Aldenmere, Henry she called him now, the name that had been waiting in the correspondence for 2 months. Aware of it in the specific way that she was aware of weather. It existed. It had effects. It was not a reason to go back inside. She had, over the course of the winter, met his family which was large and complicated and possessed of the full range of responses to the unexpected. From the sister who took one look at Nora and said, "Finally, someone interesting," to the uncle who took several weeks and several conversations and arrived eventually at a cautious and genuine warmth. She had been to London once, for a week in February, which was sufficient for her purposes, and had produced 4 useful professional contacts and 1 very good dinner at Lord Aldwick's, and the satisfying experience of watching Henry navigate a room with the ease of a man who was no longer managing his own absence from it. She had gone home to Surrey. She had written the March survey reports. She had gone to Wiltshire in March for the 5th farm. He had been there. He had brought the right maps. She had said, "You made them yourself." He had said, "I learned from a reliable source." She had said, "These are very good." He had said, "I know." She had said, "Still overconfident." He had said, "Still accurate." She had smiled. He had smiled. And the 5th farm had been surveyed with unusual efficiency, which Thomas Sutton noted in his professional log with the completely neutral expression of a man recording a fact. They were married in April in the village church near the Wiltshire estate, on a morning that was the particular clear brightness of early spring after a long winter, which Nora noted was optimal for outdoor survey work. Henry said, "We are not surveying today." She said, "I know. I was simply noting the conditions." He said, "You are noting the drainage conditions on your wedding morning." She said, "The east field has been concerning me. I want to look at it this afternoon." He said, "This afternoon?" She said, "After." He said, "Yes, after." She wore the green dress she had bought herself. She had, when the question of the dress arose, made her own decision about it with the brisk efficiency she brought to all decisions, and the dress was practical and well made, and the right shade of green for a Wiltshire April, which was the criterion she had applied. Henry had looked at it when she came down the stairs and said, "You look exactly like yourself." She had said, "That is the intention." He had said, "Yes, I know. That is why I said it." Her father was there, with the expression of a man who had spent 60 years forming opinions of people, and who had formed this one with unusual speed and unusual certainty, and who was, in his contained, practical way, very happy. Henry's sister was there, and had declared Nora her favourite person at the wedding before the ceremony began, which Nora had told her was premature, and his sister had said, "I have been watching my brother for 2 seasons, and I know what I am looking at." The vicar performed the ceremony. They were married. In the afternoon, she looked at the east field. The drainage issue was what she had suspected. A secondary blockage downstream from the one they had cleared in November, the kind that formed as a consequence of the primary repair and that needed addressing before the summer rains. She said, "This needs to come out before June." He said, "I will have it done." She said, "I can write the specifications." He said, "I know you can." She said, "You should probably learn to write them yourself." He said, "I have a teacher." She looked at him. He was looking at the field with the same focused attention he brought to everything now. The real attention. The kind she had been producing in him since October, which was the attention of someone genuinely interested in the thing in front of them, rather than managing the impression they were making about it. She thought, "I walked into the wrong house looking for a farm, and found the right one." She thought, the map was wrong, and everything else was correct. She thought about the drawing room, the 15 people, the mud, the laugh that had arrived without permission, because the situation was genuinely, irreducibly funny. She thought about the walk to the farm and the field on Friday, and the letters through October and November, and the South Field in Somerset at 8 in the morning, and the drive from London in February, with the maps he had made himself. She thought,
None of it was what was supposed to happen. She thought it was better. She closed her notebook. She said, "I am going to need to come back to this field in June." He said, "I know." She said, "And in September, for the autumn assessment." He said, "I know." She said, "And every spring, for the foreseeable future, because this valley has structural drainage issues that are going to require ongoing attention." He said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know. That is the point." She looked at him. He looked at her. She thought, he has rejected every lady in England, and I walked in with mud on my boots looking for a farm. She thought, I am glad I misread the map. She thought, I am going to be glad about it for the rest of my life. The April field was bright around them. The drainage channel ran quietly at the edge of it. Somewhere in the house, a drawing room was full of people who had come for the wedding and who were, at this moment, wondering where the newly married couple had gone.
She put the notebook in her bag. He offered her his arm. They walked back through the field together in the April light, which was excellent for survey work. She did not mention this. She thought it very loudly. He, who had been learning to read her for 6 months, heard it. He smiled. She smiled. The field went on being a field, and that was entirely enough.